All right, so today we're diving into a recent, really wide-ranging interview with the controversial Islamic preacher, Dr. Zakir Naik. We're going to explore his story, his exile, and his worldview, but all of it directly from his own words. Let's get right into it.
So he kicks things off with a pretty bold statement, right? Naik really doesn't pull any punches when it comes to the main conflict in his public life. This quote sums up his entire relationship with the Indian government, which he claims sees him as its top public enemy. And why? In his view, it's because he's so effective at converting non-Muslims to Islam.
But, to really get a handle on the man at the center of all this, you got to go back to the beginning. His life didn't always revolve around preaching. It actually started on a completely different path. Yeah, this slide really shows you the huge pivot his life took. He was a medical student, following in his dad's footsteps, and he genuinely believed medicine was the noblest profession in the world. He was training to be a doctor of bodies. But then, one single encounter changed, well, everything.
In this quote right here, this is that turning point. It was 1987 when he met the famous South African preacher Ahmed Deedat. After hearing Deedat speak, Naik was so inspired that he just switched tracks. He decided to dedicate his life to what he calls healing the soul through preaching Islam instead of healing the body.
Okay, so that brings us to the next big chapter in his life. And this is a huge one. The accusations that led to his exile, making it so he can't go back home to India.
According to Naik, this all happened incredibly fast. Back in July 2016, there was a terrible terrorist attack in Dhaka. A couple of days later, a newspaper in Bangladesh reported that one of the attackers was a follower of his on Facebook. Just a follower. But he claims the Indian media grabbed that word, twisted it, and suddenly the story became that he inspired the attack. That just set off a complete firestorm. Since he was already traveling abroad, this media narrative and the government investigations that followed basically slammed the door shut on him ever going back.
All right, now this is where the story takes a really dramatic turn. This is maybe the most startling claim from his entire interview. Naik alleges that while he was in exile, he got a secret offer, and not just from anyone, but from the very top levels of the Indian government.
He describes this clandestine meeting, in a five-star hotel in Malaysia. An emissary shows up, claiming to represent both the Prime Minister and the Home Minister of India. And this all happened just a few months before that really controversial decision to revoke Article 370, which had given special status to Kashmir.
So the deal on the table was allegedly this. In exchange for a safe, high-profile return to India, with all charges dropped, he says he was asked to publicly support the government's move on Kashmir.
His refusal, he says, was absolute, a hard no. He framed the offer as a request to betray his fellow Muslims and his faith, which he says he could never, ever do. He told the emissary that he saw the actions in Kashmir as an injustice, and there was no way he could support it.
So, while all this political drama has defined his exile, a whole other part of his public identity was forged way before that, in the intellectual arena of religious debate. In the interview, he kind of looked back on the opponents who gave him the biggest challenge.
Yeah, over decades of debating, two names really stood out to him. One for his immense popularity, and the other for his deep intellectual research that posed a totally unique challenge.
He describes the spiritual leader Sri Sri Ravi Shankar as the most popular person he ever debated, simply because of his massive following. But he calls William Campbell his most researched and intelligent opponent. See, Campbell had written a book detailing 38 alleged scientific errors in the Quran, and for years, Naik says no Muslim scholar had really managed to refute it. So for him, that debate was his toughest intellectual battle.
So even though he's living in Malaysia, you gotta understand, Naik is still a very vocal commentator on Indian politics, especially on issues that he feels are critical to the Muslim community.
And his most recent focus has been on this proposed amendment to the Waqf Act. Now, this act governs properties that are donated for religious or charitable purposes in Islam, and he's raising some serious red flags about the proposed changes.
To get a sense of what's at stake here, just look at this number. According to Naik, the Muslim Waqf Board is the third largest landholder in all of India. We're talking over 9.4 lakh acres of land. To put that in perspective, that's an area larger than some small countries.
And here's why he's so worried. He fears this amendment is basically designed to give the government the power to seize all these properties. He warns that if the bill passes, thousands of mosques, graveyards, and schools could just be gone. That's why he's been urging Indian Muslims to formally object to the legislation.
So what does the future hold for him? The interview sheds a little bit of light on his personal plans and the conditions under which he might one day see his home again.
He actually laid out some very specific conditions for potential return. First, the current BJP government would have to be out of power. Then, he says the next government would need to be just and guarantee he wouldn't be wrongfully imprisoned. He even points to a court judgment where a judge apparently noted that prosecutors had failed to provide a single clip of him promoting terrorism as evidence for their case.
For now, though, a return to India seems pretty much off the table. He does have more immediate travel plans, however. He mentioned a trip to Pakistan was all set for 2020, but got canceled because of the pandemic, and he says he intends to make that visit happen soon.
So after hearing his story in his own words, you're left with this big question. What's next? He's been a preacher, a debater, and now a political exile. As he navigates his future, it really remains to be seen which of these roles